technical guys in advance. But yeah, it should be doable, I guess.
Good evening, everyone. I think it's time to get started here while I get Lorne mic'd up. First of all, some admin issues. Next week, we're going to have Peter Mahoro, Dr. Peter Mahoro. Peter is the Senior Vice President for Technology and Development at Pedernales Electric. For those of you familiar with the local electric co-ops, Pedernales is one of the largest electrical co-ops in the area, has a rather bifurcated service area, so it's rather unique. They have some very high meter density areas they serve in western Austin, and then they have some very low density meter areas out in the rural parts out by Fredericksburg, which creates a unique challenge for that co-op on how they do improvements in infrastructure and how they lay those costs against all their customer base. As you can imagine, there's some contention in how that's done. He's going to talk about how Pedernales is moving forward into the future and trying to deal with those issues, as well as modernizing the infrastructure of their utility. So that'll be next week. And before I introduce Lorne, one really important thing, he has agreed to meet with us this evening afterwards for pizza and beer over at Varsity. So for those of you who like pizza and like beer, or non-adult beverages as well, we'll move over to the Varsity after this, and we'll continue the discussion with him. So I'd encourage you to come to that. He's a very engaging person, especially in person, and so please take advantage of that. Now, normally I just wing these things, but he actually came up to me and handed me this because he's a journalist, and so I'm just going to wing this thing.
Please wing it. It was merely in case you didn't have a cup of talking points.
I did bring my own when I printed out, of course.
Yeah, but that's
second of our Energy Journalism Fellows here at the Energy Institute. The first one was last year, Russell Gold from the Wall Street Journal, and Lorne is our second, so the second annual journalism fellow. Yeah. He has quite a background, though. If you're familiar with in the entertainment industry, they talk about triple threats, actors and actresses who can sing, they can dance, and they can act. This man is a triple threat in journalism. He's been on radio, he's been on television, and he writes in print. So he is a triple threat as well. I mean, he's got a voice for radio, he's got a face for television, and he can actually write intelligently for the press. That is a rare.
You're too kind.
Videographer as well.
You're too kind.
Boo, don't go there. So that's a rare combination. But no, he has a career that is pretty impressive. He currently works for the Fronteras desk of NPR station in eastern Texas. He focuses on Mexico and Latin America. He's reported from Colombia, Peru, Panama, Guatemala, El Salvador, and of course the U.S.-Mexico border. I'm sensing a theme here, a little bit of a Central American and South American theme. In addition to the NPR member stations that comprise the Fronteras desk, he's filed for NPR's programs Morning Edition, All Things Considered, Marketplace. These all sound so familiar. I must listen to NPR a little bit. He's contributed to Revista, the Harvard Review of Latin America, and it's published there extensively. And his recent story on land displacement and bloodshed in northern Mexico along the border received an award last year, something called the Edward R. Murrow Award. That name just kind of resonates. Why have I heard that before? Edward R. Murrow Award. Very impressive, very distinguished award. And that was for his investigative reporting in 2016. He is so good at investigative reporting in Mexico, we're not filming this because we don't want his face to get out there too much, honestly.
Well, actually, they're going. That was a consideration. But
no, we should pull
We're going to wing it. We're going to wing it. We're going to wing it.
You know, where you go, I would not.
Well.
I mean, this is one of the things. Journalism is not always just sitting behind your desk typing away at a keyboard on, why you don't like President Trump. Sometimes it's some pretty serious topics that can get you in trouble and can get you dead. And that's the kind of work this gentleman does. So he has a very interesting perspective on what's going on in Latin and Central America, and in particular in Mexico. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about that tonight. He did go to school. Where was that again? That little school up in Middlebury College. Beautiful school, but more importantly, in my opinion, he went then to the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia. Another one of those schools you hear a little bit about when you talk about journalism. So that was kind of winging it, right?
That's good. That's
from
good.
The script and
I appreciate that. That's
but here recently, he's focused a lot on what's going on in Mexico with their energy reforms. If you haven't heard about this, Mexico has taken some great strides, not only at the constitutional level, but at the local jurisdictional level in trying to do an energy reform, and they do need it, but it's a struggle. It's a great struggle, not only culturally, but technologically and economically, to achieve what Mexico is trying to do over the next 10, 15, and 20 years. And he's been reporting it extensively on that. So he's going to talk to us this evening about some of his work there, some of the progress they've made, and his perspective on that area. I think that's enough of an introduction.
Please,
I'll hand it over to you. He's got about 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and then we'll follow up with questions. Lorne Matalon.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Is this working? Is this working? 1, 2? Yes, it is. Thank you very much. I want to just start out by saying that some of the things I'm going to talk about tonight are I guess, could be perceived about in a negative light with respect to Mexico. I love Mexico. I'm not Mexican. I'm not Latin. I was born in Canada. I'm a dual national, U.S. and Canada. But I love Mexico very much, and I really believe Mexican energy reform is going to work, notwithstanding the struggles that Dr. Beach just mentioned. So Mexican energy reform in a time of insecurity. When I first started pursuing this, insecurity, the word insecurity meant to me the things that we all assume with the word insecurity. With respect to the energy sector, it means violence in the oil field, organized crime, working in collusion with Pemex workers or fired Pemex workers to steal oil, corruption within Pemex itself, and the general state of insecurity in the oil and gas fields of Mexico. Insecurity, I mean, we can't ignore it, has come to take on a different connotation as a consequence of the election of a president who has denigrated Mexico, who famously said after saying that they're drug dealers and rapists, and then he said, quote, "I assume that some of them are good people." This is not going to be a political talk, but that is really resonating in Mexico among the decision makers within the energy complex as Mexico tries, with U.S. help, principally, not just European foreign energy companies, but principally United States, American companies, many of them here in Texas, to move forward on something that is obviously critical to the economy and the security itself of Mexico. So Mexican energy reform to me is not a story about how many BTUs are traveling through a 10-inch diameter pipeline, nor is it confined to the fact that the pipeline capacity from the United States to Mexico is going to double between 2015 and 2018. Instead, Mexican energy reform is a story of principally right now of hope, right? It's hope that, for example, just to name a few obvious examples, Mexicans pay on the residential side 25% more for their electricity than you or I do. They pay some of the highest electricity bills in the hemisphere. On the commercial side, it's about 100% more. That shouldn't be the case, but it is. And so Mexican energy reform, to me, is all about the social dynamics of Mexico. And why does that matter here in Texas or here in the United States? It matters because a Mexico with a more robust economy, one that has regular supplies that are stable and predictable at a fair price for their manufacturing sector, means a more stable Mexico, means that we will have a more stable neighbor. And so that's to me what it's all about. Mexican energy reform is hope that the refining capacity of Mexico will be sort of brought from the brink of non-existence, right? In all of Mexico right now, there are 6 refineries. 6 refineries in the entire Republic of Mexico. In Houston alone, there are 11. 11 that are so important that people joke in the halls of power at Pemex and CFE, the Federal Electricity Commission, that Houston's become like another state in Mexico, for the simple reason that so much of the gasoline that Mexicans use is refined here. There are questions about that. There are questions going forward as to whether or not there'll be taxes. We've all heard about the uncertainty with respect to the new American administration. There's also hope that, for example, that the petrochemical industry, which is next to moribund, is going to be brought and made more robust, by companies like this one. This is taken at the Braskem complex in Veracruz. I went there to talk to the people and really get a really good perspective from one of the early players in Mexican energy reform. So Braskem is Latin America's largest petrochemical company. An economy can't exist without petrochemicals, and these guys are leading the way. So that's what Mexican energy reform is to me, and I hope you'll filter my comments through that prism. It's not so much about the technology, because the technology works, right? The technology is is working very well. But it's a complicated society, and it's a complicated issue to try and basically fast forward an industry that's been sort of calcifying for decades, right, since 1938, and we'll talk about the significance, of that year. So ultimately, it is so important at the boardroom level, of course, but it matters in the street. It matters because a lot of Mexicans don't understand what Mexican energy reform is, and for them, it is such a potent symbol of nationalism that they can't get their head around the fact that after Mexico went out of its way in the 30s to expel foreign companies, all in the name of nationalism, that now they're being allowed back in. And they don't really understand why that's happening because they have not yet seen this promise realized, the promise of the lower prices that I just talked about. We just saw in January, just to sort of talk extemporaneously, something called the gasolinazo. Anybody here from Mexico knows what that's about. But what that was just the wild fluctuation, the rise, ultimately, of gasoline prices. Gasoline prices are always higher in Mexico compared to the United States, which is a bitter irony for countries so rich in oil. But I'll explain why that's happening as we go through this brief talk. And so Mexican energy reform, the first example of what it could do was realized in January when the price subsidies on gasoline were lifted. And instead of the prices going down, the prices went up. There were near daily riots in Mexico City, in Monterrey, in the south, in Oaxaca. And that has somewhat stabilized now, but because it's being rolled out, this withdrawal of subsidies on a regional basis, it's extremely difficult for anybody to predict what the price will be in their given area. So those are some of the challenges. Mexican energy reform is about a momentous decision that has been taken by the current Mexican administration of Enrique Peña Nieto. He's an embattled president right now, but I'm going to focus for the time being on his efforts at reform. This is only one example, the energy sector, of that reform. So he shepherded through a decision through the Congress, through the Mexican Senate, to reverse the expulsion of foreign companies in the energy sector. The decision's now been made to reopen the Mexico's domestic energy and electricity markets, to reverse just an underperforming sector that was just on the brink of collapse, and some think that it still is, as I'll explain in a second. However, if I can depart, and just really briefly, that decision has come, at a political cost. The U.S. administration is loathed in Mexico for the reasons I just talked about, and the words of Trump are like, one guy told me down there, it was, I don't speak Spanish fluently, but un puñal clavado, like a dagger plunged into the heart of the Mexican people. And that has, been playing out as we look forward to 2018. That's when Mexico is that's next year, they're going to elect a new president. And the words of the President of the United States have given a gift to an embattled will be presidential candidate who was kind of casting about for political relevancy. Those of you from Mexico know him well. It's Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the former mayor of Mexico City, an ardent nationalist, an ardent leftist. He shares a lot of the nationalist bent, if you will, that at least publicly President Trump has expressed. And, why does that matter with respect to energy reform? Well, it matters because he's leading the polls right now, because President Trump gave him a gift by slamming Mexico. And all of a sudden, because, and I say casting about for relevancy, political relevancy, he lost the last two presidential elections, he claims, by electoral fraud. Certainly in the case of in 2006, he lost it to President Felipe Calderón. Without getting into inside baseball, Felipe Calderón launched a U.S.-inspired drug war, and it didn't go very well. The government says 100,000 people were killed. NGOs say it's like double that. And why does that matter for the energy reform? Well, if the polls show Andrés Manuel López Obrador leading the polls, if he is to win, he says on day one he's going to abrogate energy reform. So, and he has a lot of support. He has a lot of support because it's one of those touchstone nationalist issues that especially those people on the left who don't really understand why this happened, why this was ever enacted, that is Mexican energy reform. They don't understand why it's happened, so he's getting, he's riding that wave. So the polls show him leading, and with that, I want to sort of go back, if you will, just to get started. A little bit of history that sort of links the 20s to a pivotal date, 1938, when oil and gas were nationalized in Mexico, to 2012, when the current president was elected, and he decided to enact a suite of reforms, among them energy reform. Following the crafting of the Constitution in 1917, nationalists in the 20s argued that foreign companies in Mexico in the energy sector were operating as if they were operating in conquered territory, right? There were many examples of workers being denigrated, wages not being paid out, things like that. And so nationalists in the 20s looked at the Mexican Constitution that was signed in 1917, and I want to just refer to my notes. Article 27 of that Constitution said that resources under the ground belonged to the Mexican Republic and not to the people who had land on the surface. Obviously, foreign oil companies fought against that notion, right? They had been used to dealing in Mexico through bribery, through intimidation, through blackmail in some cases. And so the upshot, if you will, of that is that there was a call to expel the foreign companies. This is about going back in the 1920s. At that point, there was an agreement basically to disagree, all right? I want to fast forward to 1927. 1927, there was a real risk, or a perceived risk in Mexico, that the United States was going to invade. Because in their mind, right, the Mexican Revolution had taken place not that long previous, 1910, 1920, and Woodrow Wilson, right, the guy who's credited with the League of Nations and the United Nations, which spawned the United Nations, he had invaded Mexico. And there was real fear in Mexico that that was going to happen again. The president of Mexico at that time called on one of his generals. That general was Lázaro Cárdenas. And he told Lázaro Cárdenas, I want you to get ready to burn the oil fields, kind of like a la Saddam Hussein if we get invaded. They didn't get invaded, but the die was cast. The die would ultimately be realized, terrible metaphor, but the die was cast, and that led to actions in 1938. Lázaro Cárdenas, a really pivotal guy. 1938, he's the president of Mexico, and he is somebody who's been cultivating a relationship with unions, and he decides to make unions more powerful, not just in the energy sector. And that's a real threat to the oil companies. There's a standoff. The oil workers plan to go on strike. As president of Mexico, he decides this cannot happen. I cannot have a strike, because other unions wanted to get in on a general strike. They said, we're going to support the Union of Petroleros, the oil workers union. At the same time, he didn't want the oil industry to shut down for obvious reasons, for the implications that would have on the Mexican economy. So what he did was, he went back to Michoacan in central Mexico, his native state. He talked with sort of his political muses, if you will, and he decided that he was going to create Pemex. He was going to create a state-owned oil company that ended up until 2013-14 being a monopoly. So that's the background on the expulsion of foreign companies, and it makes what happened with the reopening of Mexico so very critical, and it's really important to understand those roots, I think. This wasn't taking place in a vacuum. Standard Oil was being buffeted by headwinds in Bolivia, and Mexicans were watching that very closely. There was a strike down in Bolivia, and there was just a sort of a rising awareness, or a feeling, justified or otherwise, that Mexicans had to take control of their own energy assets. Pemex was created by Lázaro Cárdenas, and it's had some really wonderful successes. We're going to talk about some of its problems, but just to bring it up to modern day, the Cantarell field, the Cantarell offshore field, made Mexico into an oil exporter in the 1970s. It was such a pivotal part of the Mexican economy at that time. it was producing about 2 million barrels a day. Last year, Cantarell produced about 200 to 250,000, optimistically. It used to represent 50, 60, 70% of the production of Mexico. Last year, 2016, about 9%, right? The reason for that is because there was no foreign expertise, or there was no capital investment, because the Mexican government kept stealing money legally, I should say, to buttress its own social programs, to build hospitals and schools, to famously in Chihuahua City build a world-class baseball stadium that nobody ever uses. Mexico was awash in oil money. That oil money was always taken by the state, by the federal government, to take care of the things it couldn't do otherwise, right? It relied so much on Pemex, so that Pemex was never given the opportunity to reinvest in itself. It was never given a chance to actually succeed economically. So Mexico has several offshore fields that are part of energy reform, the focus of energy reform, and the focus, foreign companies are salivating to get in them. One of them is the Trion field offshore. It sits just on the other side of the maritime border with the United States. On the U.S. side, it's been prolific in terms of production. So there's every reason to believe that the Trion field is going to reap great rewards for Mexico. And on the 6th of December last, right before Christmas, there was a successful auction. The previous July, there'd been an auction that was terribly unsuccessful, but this one was very successful. Companies like ExxonMobil, Chevron, BHP Billiton, and Australia, of course, Statoil of Norway, China's offshore oil company, they won bids to develop Trion and 8 of 10 deepwater blocks in the Gulf, awarded to bidders outside of Mexico, which is quite an accomplishment. And Mexico deserves a lot of credit for that, because for a company determined, to let in foreign companies, that was a real landmark achievement. So there are sort of 5 pillars of the new Pemex. Then we're going to move to gas and electricity. One is to create, and all these are sort of in motion, in flux. One is to create new contracts for oil and gas, for E&P exploration. That's not solid. So in other words, when a foreign company comes in, one of the obstacles that Mexico is facing right now is sort of would come under the umbrella of best practices, right? We know if you go to Norway or the Great Britain or Japan, you know what a contract's going to look like. You know exactly how you have to fulfill it, and you know what it's going to ask of you in return. That is not quite the case, because they keep changing in Mexico. But to be fair, it's because this is a nascent energy reform. It's very hard to take a monopoly market and open it up and have everything, boom, 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 working really right. So that's the first thing. The second thing, Pemex still retains the right of first refusal on developing Mexican resources before the private companies come in. Third, there's been a creation of a new regulatory environment in Mexico. Again, it's kind of nascent, but it's, I think Mexico deserves a lot of credit. The Energy Regulatory Commission, the Secretary of Energy, and the National Hydrocarbons Commission are sort of overseeing the way foreign companies come in. Pemex still remains state-owned, right? There's a myth out there, or not a myth, but it hasn't been, I don't think, accurately reported. It is still a state agency. But things like the administration, certain outside costs, are going to be autonomous, and Pemex will be in a position to compete with their own bids against foreign companies. And then the natural gas spin-off. So Syndicates, which is a regulatory agency, has taken over the authority over Pemex's natural gas pipelines, again, as a way of diffusing, of breaking off the monopoly from Pemex, really a largely calcified organization. 1997, Mexico imported 2% of its natural gas. Just jumping to gas for a minute. That jumped to 27% in 2012. And that happened just as Peña was assuming power. Obviously, that seems incongruous for a country with such proven, although untapped, resources in both natural gas and oil. The thing is, with Mexico is hamstrung. It's hamstrung by the type of oil and the type of gas that it has on its territory. Just briefly with oil, it brings up something called the Maya mix, right? And the refineries in Mexico, the few of them, the 6, the half dozen, they're designed to process light sweet crude, like the kind we have here in Texas. So Mexico ends up sending a lot of its oil to Houston, as I mentioned before, bringing back that refined gas. And it's not a matter of no capacity. It's just like they're not suited to refine the type of oil that they have. So Mexicans are paying so much for their gasoline, and until the 1st of January, the Mexican government subsidized gasoline to the tune of about 3% of GDP, which is just insane. Let's move to 2013-14, Peña Nieto. Peña Nieto wins power. By the way, in case somebody was asking me before, these are all my photographs. I don't deserve credit or blame. I just in case anybody wants to know, these are my photographs. So Peña becomes the face of an old franchise, right? And again, I'm trying to simplify, perhaps overly so, Mexican history. But until 2001 party, his party, the PRI, the Revolutionary Institutional Party, PRI, ruled Mexico. 2000, Vicente Fox wins. He's then followed by Felipe Calderon, who I mentioned before. And after a 12-year absence of the PRI from power, he is the new face of the franchise, and he wins the election. The same election that, again, was tainted by allegations of fraud. Televisa, the favored government network, would always show Peña in a crowd. But when they showed other candidates, it was always a close-up, right? So imagine if I'm looking at Dr. Beach, I want to show him at the head of a crowd, right? But if I go like this, I'm using the camera to sort of diminish his power. So he comes to power. He wants to be to show that he is the face of a new franchise, of a revamped and more legitimate politically PRI. So he takes on a suite of 3 reforms. Number 1 is he arrests in education. He wants to reform the very demonstrably corrupt teachers union. So he arrests the head of the teachers union, Esther Gordillo, just a sort of a bloated caricature of a personality on the Mexican stage. He arrests her. He says he's going to push through reform of the teachers union. Again, with teachers, they can retire. They can tell their son or daughter, I want you to replace me, and nobody does anything about it, even though that person may not be ready to teach whatsoever. Secondly, he took on some of the sacred cows in Mexico, right? He went after people like Carlos Slim, whose Telcel and Telmex, again, have some of the highest cell phone and telephony rates in the Americas. And the third and most important one was energy reform. Excuse me, was energy reform. So he wanted to reform Pemex, he wanted to reform CFE, and he had to lead through a brutal constitutional change. I say brutal because the debates were so visceral. The name calling and the sort of the labeling was so intense that many people thought it would never go through, especially because of what I mentioned before. That is the way that Mexicans associate their energy resources with their patrimonio, their nationality. So he did that. He pushed it through. He has a lot of problems relating to his own political credibility, but when his term is over, he will be judged not only on those on security. There's a general sense of insecurity in the country, but he'll be judged on the success or failure of energy reform. So this is what Mexico wants right now. It wants, of course, I'm talking about onshore now. Offshore, it's got big players, ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, BHP, Peloton, China Offshore Corporation. But this is what it wants. This is in Stanton, Texas. This is a fracking operation. That's a wellhead. He wants to bring in that American expertise and admittedly foreign expertise as well. But Texas is almost like ground zero for what he wants to do. So he wants to do that. But as he's doing that, there's a problem, right? There's a problem. This is Saturday's Excelsior, very respected newspaper. And what this says, I'm going to distill it for you. It says that, literally, it says that, 30 million, it says $1.6 billion is what it says, has been milked from Pemex pipelines. That's what this says. Kind of hard to attract foreign investment when that is happening. And this says here, the sub says 40% of gasoline stations are irregular, and that's code for It's not code for not having your stamp, for that year. It's because they're selling stolen gasoline. Very difficult to try and, it's very difficult to try and attract foreign investment from smaller and mid-sized companies. There are oil service companies, mid-size, 50, 60 employees here in Texas that are salivating at the prospect of going in. But when they sit down and they craft their budgets, they're looking at headlines like this. They're looking at headlines like this. This is also from Saturday from, the Bible of the left in Mexico, La Reforma. And it says that basically narco-violence is coming back. People in Morelos and Mexico City laugh at that because for them it's a staple of daily life. They figure they needed to sell newspapers on a weekend. So it's extremely difficult to get all but the biggest players with the deepest pockets to come in when that sort of problem is taking place. Now, pipeline theft. So Dr. Beach and I cannot go to a pipeline and tap it, right? We need to know where it is. We need to know where the tap is. And we need to know when a certain type of commodity is going to be flowing through there so that we can take it. But for the vertically integrated drug cartels and human smuggling syndicates in Mexico, it's a no-brainer, right? They do nothing to make the product, and they'll always get a good return on it. And so what's happening is that Mexico's Pemex is shedding so many jobs. It's a company that should have about 35 to 40,000 people working at it. At the start of energy reform in 2012, 2014 is when it was actually signed into law, there were 150,000 people working for Pemex for a company that should have had about 35 to 40,000 people. So what's happening is right now it's about 115,000 in 2017. So you have a whole bunch of really skilled people who don't have a job, they have no prospects, they're desperate for money, and so they're selling that information or they're collaborating with organized crime to steal that oil. And it's so ingrained in the daily life of Mexico, that is the theft of oil, that you see headlines like this on a weekend, no less, right? I mean, on a weekend when presumably there's less readership. And people at Pemex say, look, this is just one aspect of corruption in this country. We need to face it, but it's not our fault. We believe that it's the fault of state agencies, different agencies of the police, the Army. In 2015, the head of the state police in Puebla was arrested. He wasn't arrested merely for being involved in organized crime. He was arrested because he was at the scene of the tap, right? And he was surrounded by indigenous villagers who felt that this guy was doing them a favor. He was giving them an income where their government historically had not. So all this has been taking place. He's in prison now, but I can't confirm this. I don't know this for a fact, but some people that I trust very much in Mexico have told me he's been released after doing sort of a paltry symbolic stay in jail. So it's extremely difficult, and all this is happening as people who work in the oil field, really innocent, hardworking members of Pemex, are surrounded by violence all the time. Violence is a staple. Whoops, so there we are. Violence is a staple. This is taken in Tamaulipas, and this woman, I wanted to crush and make her face out of focus because, she's every woman, she's every family. That's the police guarding her on the way to school, and it's right near the Burgos Basin, which I'm sure many of you from Mexico know about. That's the heart of, it's one of the centers for oil exploration. Every day you see something like this. 6 police officers kidnapped. The government seems impervious. The reason that matters for Mexican energy reform is because, again, people are sitting around trying to draw up their budgets and saying we want to get in, but this is a really difficult situation. And right now, violence in Mexico has sort of superseded the levels of 2011. It had decreased after 2010. It sort of went back up. And there's just a general state, roadblocks. This gentleman said, I asked him, I thought he was going to say, I'm looking for drugs. He's looking for cash. He's looking for cash. He's looking principally for cash. He said, otherwise, I'm looking for guns. I have a tape of him doing this, and I was fascinated because I thought, cash, where's the cash coming from? And I asked him that. He didn't actually know. So I spoke to his boss. The boss said, well, the smuggling syndicates and the other groups that are involved in sort of the vertically integrated nature of criminal syndicates in Mexico, he was looking for cash that was being smuggled from the oil field, like stolen cash that had been taken from kidnapped Pemex workers. That's what his boss told me that day. So it's against this sort of general chaos that Mexican energy reform gets buried sometimes in terms of the very good things that it is accomplishing for Mexico. There's a quintessential role or image of Mexico that's no longer true. It sees it as a supplier of crude oil to the United States. That is no longer, the case, obviously because of the shale revolution. Since moving to deregulate energy, Mexico has become obviously very dependent on supplies from the United States. We'll talk about that briefly. But the reason that so much gas is coming from Texas is because Mexico wants to use that gas to make sure that it can make cleaner burning electricity plants and lower the price of electricity, as we spoke about before. Given that, the Trump administration, and again, this is not being political, this has direct implication for the energy sector in Mexico, but given that the Trump administration has said publicly that it wants to initiate border taxes or other trade measures that might restrict Mexican exports of energy to the United States, the question is how much is that going to impact the Mexican economy? If these policies were enacted, Mexico could opt to retaliate by preventing U.S. energy companies from investing at all in the energy space. A lot of this is what's going to happen, we don't know, the uncertainty. Uncertainty, as you know, Economics 101 is really bad for business, right? It's not a good way to attract investment. The Trump administration could actually end up, as we all know, hurting the economy of this country in terms of energy, notwithstanding the roles played by people, for example, like the former governor of Texas, now the Secretary of Energy, Rick Perry, right? So Rex Tillerson, obviously these are advocates for energy, but we don't know if their voices will be sort of diminished, if you will, or lost in the maelstrom surrounding other complicated issues that have nothing to do with Mexico. So American firms have serious investment plans, not just in oil and gas, but also in terms of electricity, pipelines, and of course downstream firms. I should point out, that BP, I saw this last week, BP has opened a gas station in Mexico. We're also seeing electric car stations in Mexico. I spoke to a saleswoman who works to sell hybrid cars. And she says, I cannot keep up with the demand. Don't know if that's directly, I don't think we could say that's directly related to energy reform, but there's a new consciousness, if you will, about energy in Mexico that has gone down to the street. And it's really, I think it's to Mexico's credit. So pipelines built in 2016 combined with others that are going to be built this year and next, they've obviously significantly boosted and will boost U.S. natural gas exports at a very time that prices are so low here, right? So obviously the upside, which is another story here. This is not a story about Mexico solely. It's a story about the upside opportunity for American investors here. And there's a lot of uncertainty among those people as well, because even though energy was excluded from NAFTA, energy exchanges are taking advantage of that regulatory environment, that framework that NAFTA put forward, and that is obviously tariff-free crossing of our respective border. U.S. shale production, it's made American natural gas very attractive for Mexico, which depends on it for 60% of its total electricity generation. Think about that. That's just an astounding statistic. It's not mine. That comes from Pemex and CFE itself. In 2015, Mexico imported about 1 billion cubic feet of natural gas. That was an increase of 300% over the previous 5 years. Between 2016 and 2020, about 60% of Mexico's electricity additions will come from natural gas. That demand will be met through imports. It's going to take a long time before Mexico is able to increase its own domestic production, which has fallen off since the 1990s. I want to stress that in the case of Pemex, it has never been given a chance to succeed by its corporate overseers, if you will, the Mexican federal government. So much of its baby steps towards actually making a profit have been cut off at the knees because the Mexican government needs Pemex money. which was, to do everything else, building roads, schools, hospitals. But it's also fueled corruption, right? Because a lot of the profits from oil have gone to the states, right? Right now, there's a slew of ex-Mexican governors, really recent, right? There's Cesar Duarte from Chihuahua and Javier Duarte from Veracruz, no relation. Both fugitives from justice, both accused of personal enrichment, that's the code. Both of them have used significant amounts of oil money. And this was replicated many times in previous administrations, whereby Mexico City sent money to the states based on oil revenue, derives from oil revenue, and there's never been a full accounting of where that money's gone. Right now, in the case of Cesar Duarte, he's been accused for a long time of illicit enrichment, and the chickens are coming to roost, and I think that's also a credit to Mexico, because part of the allegations against both of these governors is that they misused oil money. U.S. firms, I want to point out, are not the only people anxious to get into Mexico. Many of you sitting here might know a gentleman named Nicholas Borda from Haynes & Boone in Houston. He works in Mexico City. I don't know him well. I've met him once at a conference. But he released a study suggesting that there have been $90 billion in commitments from Canada, France, the UK, Japan, China, so that the theory goes that if there's some sort of regulatory insecurity injected into this process by the United States, that these other companies will come in. I met a senior player in Mexico in the energy space. He was at a dinner, he told me, where the Chinese ambassador was having a little get-together with some of the energy players in Mexico. And according to this source, who I trust very much, I've known him a long time, he told me that the Chinese ambassador said that he hopes that the U.S. withdraws from Mexico. He thinks it's a real opening for China. And so these other countries also are standing by, waiting to see what's going to take place. In July, announcements are expected concerning the next round of auctions, including financial transmission rights. That's basically going to allow foreign investors to mitigate the cost, or the potential cost, to the price risk of delivering energy to the grid. Upstream, the big winners of last year's deepwater auctions, Exxon and Chevron, it's not going to be until the end of 2017 that these companies will actually start to deploy the funds that they said that they would in those auctions. And obviously, they have the deep pockets to look a long way ahead, right? Energy reform was contemplated when the price of oil, price of crude, was around $100 per barrel. We all know, and it makes news now as it, if it breaks 50, let's just say. So the pitch from Pemex, the pitch from other energy players in Mexico is that these foreign investors need to make sure that they take the long-term view and see where they might be in 10 years. It's going to take 7, 8, 9, 10 years before these offshore fields start to produce, and we don't know where the price of oil will be at that time. But the assumption, the hope I should say, not the assumption, is that it won't be where it is right now. Oil services. A lot of new business for the giant firms like Halliburton and Weatherford, of course. And also, Mexico is looking to places like UT. It's looking to places like Stanford. It's looking to places like MIT that produce petroleum engineers who are top rate. That's another opportunity for the United States participation in there. So the question now is, what happens if the Trump administration actually makes restrictive measures on investment in Mexico, either as a part of a trade war against Mexico or in response to Mexico flexing its muscles and retaliating economically against this country. I cannot right now there's a move to boycott U.S. corn. It's never going to happen. That's not the point. Corn, there's an expression in Spanish. Forgive me, I'm not fluent, but, sin maíz no hay país. Without corn, there's no country. So one senator has proposed a boycott of corn. It's extremely popular, but right now it's in the platitude stage. I'm not sure that's actually going to take place. But the point that that's even being contemplated is not a surprise in Mexico, but it's shaking up things here in the United States. Mexico has several economic retaliatory measures at its disposal. And so there's a fear that Mexico may take action against the U.S. energy complex in the event that those measures, restrictive measures, take place. Two important figures on the front lines. Regulatory uncertainty is something that Mexican Energy Undersecretary Cesar Hernandez Ochoa deals with all the time. He is a brilliant man. He's a Fulbright scholar. He is somebody who's been a long-time advocate of free trade. He's written extensively about it, and he has said publicly that it's a really unfair, or not unfair, I shouldn't say, but more of a, it's a very unstable environment if one country takes economic measures against the other. And he said, implying, not stating directly, he said that if there's economic threats against us that are realized, the expansion of the border wall, the stopping of remittances, the withdrawal from NAFTA by the United States, which would dismantle it, we have to take some sort of retaliatory response, and that might include energy. And obviously he's not somebody who wants that to happen. He's an extremely honest person, and I say honest, that's not to denigrate other people, but usually when you meet somebody of that stature, there are many handlers recording every word and taking photographs. I was brought into his office and I said, okay, are we going to wait for the other folks? And he said, no, let's go. Spoke to him for an hour and 20 minutes at the end of a very long day, and he was extremely forthcoming about the prospects for Mexican energy reform and how he felt that the uncertainty created by the new U.S. administration was something that he hoped wouldn't translate into restrictive measures against his country. He said that it's a very bad environment because we will be forced to retaliate in some way, if for no other reason than to show the Mexican street that we're not going to take this rolling down. He's a big booster, as I say. He sees a North American integrated electric market that goes from the Canadian Arctic to the Rio Suchiate, the border with Guatemala. And he said, this is not a matter of some sort of Pollyanna dream. He said, very often, in our country, in your country, there's going to be outages. Right? Wouldn't it be great if we could coordinate and have a unified grid? Now, there are problems technically with that because the grid of Mexico has a different cycle than the grid here. But there are already 10 cases of cross-border electricity exchanges. I'm just doing a piece for NPR on that. And, you know, they're going both ways. You know, Blackstone Venture Capital in New York has the plant in Frontera, Texas, in Mission, Texas, it's called the Frontera plant. 100% decoupled from the grid in Texas. 100% of what it makes is going to help lower electricity prices in Mexico. They're doing this because they can make more money selling to Mexico. I should point that out. This is not altruism, but that's not the point. That's how business works. And on the other side of the country, on the left coast, there's an ejido, a farm collective in Baja California, sending all of the power it generates through wind power to the California grid. That's a project of Sempra Energy. It has a subsidiary in Mexico, and they are it's been going on for a couple of years, and this gentleman told me that Nogales, Arizona and Nogales, Sonora are going to be linked up this year, making it number 11. Second person I'd like to mention, Jose Manuel Carrera, Director of New Business Development, of Pemex. He has a ton of issues on his plate. Pemex's finances right now are extremely messy, notwithstanding the fact that foreign analysts in New York, in LA, say that this is a good sector to get involved in. Pemex has received 2 nasty downgrades in the last 12 months, right? One was from Fitch, one was from Moody's. Moody's issued a downgrade, meaning that it's much harder for them to borrow money. Fitch said they're on the brink of insolvency, i.e. they can't pay their debts. They cannot pay their debts. Not a good way to try and attract foreign investment. He also has to deal with a union. The union of Pemex, which I should point out is not going to really be a factor for foreign investors, but foreign companies in Mexico will have to deal with them along the supply chain at some point or another. That union is divided right now. It is headed by a demonstrably corrupt senator. It's kind of inconceivable to me. He's a senator. He's also head of the union. And his children and he take to social media to flaunt their wealth on a regular basis. And it's an embarrassment to Mexico. And I've asked many people, and I've never gotten an answer that really satisfies me. And I've said, how can this be allowed to happen? It's the optics on it are terrible. And the reason is this. We talked about that suite of three reforms that Pena wants to put through: education, telecommunications, energy. Well, he's picked a real fight with the teachers' union, and he doesn't want to do the same thing with a very politically powerful oil workers' union. And so basically, the answer from politicians, senators, intellectuals, academics is like, he's just going to use kid gloves. That's not going to happen. But this guy has to deal with that, right? He has to deal with a union that's been historically intransigent. Right now, they are going along with things like dumping pension obligations, moving them over to the Treasury, so that the Treasury has to deal with it. But the Treasury gets its money from the federal government, which in turn gets its money from Pemex. So it's kind of a vicious circle. And what's going to happen, we don't know. He has been aggressive about cutting the fat. He and the CEO of Pemex, they are, as I say, dumping their pension obligations. And he just said to me, changing the corporate culture here is not going to be easy. And I think it's evident for some of those reasons. It's got that bloated workforce. It's become kind of calcified. Corruption's taken as a staple. He's really upset about pipeline theft. Pipeline theft is what Pemex blamed for the gasolinazo in January. And he said that, I asked him, isn't that kind of an oversimplistic way? I mean, aren't there other factors, namely the lifting of subsidies? He said, no, the lifting of subsidies is fine. I'm not so sure. It's being done in a sort of a region-by-region basis, so Mexicans themselves don't really know what the price will be that day. And it's very convenient to say, well, oil theft is our problem. And he pointed, to his credit, it should be mentioned, the hiring of companies outside of Mexico to set up cameras and drones over the oil fields. But you just saw that headline from last Saturday, and there'll be more. I want to pull up a couple of graphs. This just shows you just how important, this is not strictly to do with energy, but it was hoped that sort of, these lines would go up. And I think we'll start to see that, but it's so important, the U.S. participation in that sector, that you understand why there's so many people who are flummoxed by the uncertainty coming out of Washington right now. A country of its size should be, 4%, 5% GDP growth every year. The Bank of Mexico came out the week before last, and they said it's going to be around 2%. So Mexico's in tough that way. Trade imbalances with Mexico that President Trump rails against, those are deals really between businesses. They're not deals between countries. And Econ 101, right? If you make a deal and two people are happy, there are two winners. So a lot of times when we talk about this trade deficit, it's not a country-to-country thing, but it just shows you just how valuable trade with the United States is. In addition to all this, in addition to everything that the Army has to deal with, the Army is being asked to, it's completely stretched. It's never been trained to fight urban warfare. It's really never been trained to fight a war, right? The Mexican Army historically has been trained to help people in the event of a disaster. 2006, they get dispatched by Felipe Calderon to deal with the cartels. I should point out that one cartel was left alone, the one headed by Mr. Guzman, who's now in a New York jail, at the expense of other ones. The deal was made. You give us information on your rivals, we'll go after them, and we'll let the Army take care of them. These pictures, so now this is a mission to protect an area that was about to be explored right at the confluence of the borders of three states, Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua, right? And in that part of Chihuahua especially, there's a lot of oil exploration. And so I took advantage of an opportunity to go out with these guys. They wanted to take me to, they say, we'll take you to we'll show you the burning of drugs. I said, no, I don't want to do that. I said, show me what you're actually doing up there. And so these are pictures taken, they did stop, actually, they stopped, they saw this from the sky, and they stopped. These are poppy flowers, heroin's made from them. But here's an example. So this guy, I put my life in his hands. I wanted to find out about energy. So this guy, his name is Moises Melo Garcia. And I asked him, I said, do you think the Army should be taking care of protecting the oil fields, drug eradication, that type of thing? And he said, we have to do it because the police are entirely corrupt. So I get back to the United States, and this guy's on the DEA wanted list, right? So he's in trouble, and it just shows you what happens in Mexico. And I was really disappointed. I like to think I have good radar. Clearly, it failed in this case. Imagine if you live in Mexico and have to deal with these people. These are soldiers who were sent out basically to live in the field. They're like abandoned, basically, for weeks on end. And they were so happy to see the helicopter landing. They thought they were getting out of there. It was just like, no, we're just stopping to say hello. And then this is just some pictures of what they actually do, eradicating crops and basically establishing a presence. But here's the rub. The Army has been involved in several incidents recently that people at Pemex told me makes them afraid to use them because the Army's lost some credibility. We had a problem with the helicopter, nothing major. There was a gauge out and they weren't sure what it was. So we landed, this is in Sinaloa, northern Sinaloa, and this is a pilot. The pilot's also his own security, right? With it's crazy. You can see his credentials on his left, your right. This crowd shows up, and I started to get terrified, frankly, because these people, the picture doesn't do it justice, because that's all I had the courage to actually fire away with my camera. These people were saying, get the heck out of here, in really, really crude language, meaning we don't want the Army here. We don't want the Army here. So that's a problem. And these are the equally distrusted, perhaps for good reason, not perhaps, for good reason, the federal police. So let me just go back for a second. So basically, Mexican energy reform will work, but it has to overcome some of these entrenched problems that we talked about. When you want to initiate reform, when you want to push it through, you need to have a mandate that's, based on credibility. And unfortunately, for all his good intentions, the current president of Mexico is really, really suffering in the polls right now. And it's more or less problems of his own doing. Lack of responses to I know you all heard about this, the murder of those 43 students. It was actually 49. It's reported as 43, but it was 49. Took, 3-4 weeks? I think it was a month before he actually responded. Then he decided, I'm going to raise the role of the Army, and I'm going to eliminate all local police. So the Mexicans said, well, that means you're going to have us policed by the state police. And the state police, as per the example I gave you before, are not trusted. So it's really a difficult situation. There was an Army massacre in June of 2014. The U.S. suspended military aid to the battalion involved. The Mexican government justified it at the time because the young people who had surrendered, clearly, they claimed were members of organized crime. But, you don't shoot people against the wall, right? And they got caught. And that's just one of many examples. The holy trinity of Mexican society is like, the country, motherhood, the Army. That's basically it, the flag, if you will, nationalism. And the Army has taken such a terrible beating that it's impossible for Peña to call on them to take care of security in the oil fields, which for the reasons I laid out is so critically important. I want to just briefly play a piece of tape for you. One of the aspects of Mexican energy reform has to do with suddenly valuable land in the northern states, right? Dusty scrub land. And it all has to do with energy development. What's happening, this will be self-explanatory, but just to set it up briefly, this is a short piece of audio. I have some pictures to go with it, but basically what's happening is that this is a story about Chihuahua. What happened is that many people there's been a slow motion depopulation in the Juarez Valley. The Juarez Valley is the site of Pemex explorations onshore. It is the site that has been sort of selected for onshore development. There's a corridor that sort of goes right along, Chihuahua, Coahuila, Tamaulipas. Tamaulipas is a whole separate issue because of the Zetas and their control of oil and gas there. But basically, I'd like to play this for you. These are people who are being displaced simply because of their the unfortunate coincidence that they live on land that has been slated for development under Mexican energy reform.
Here's the allegation. People interviewed for this story claim they've been forced off their land, burned out of their homes, and that many others have been murdered. They live in a string of Mexican towns hugging the U.S. border to the southeast of El Paso, Texas. The region sits on top of oil and gas deposits, and that's why residents claim they've been forced out. One of those towns is Guadalupe, a few minutes from the U.S. border. Construction on a superhighway and a state-of-the-art border crossings underway. According to Mexican census rolls, nearly 10,000 people lived here in 2005. The mayor, who declined to be interviewed, claimed in local media that this year only about 1,000 people remain. One man, who like others asked not to be identified, explained what's happened.
El gobierno manda gente para presionar a los dueños de las tierras. Vete de aquí, no te queremos aquí.
The state government sends people here to pressure landowners to get out of here, to say, go away, we don't want you here. He says wealthy buyers then show up to grab the vacant land.
Vienen los compradores, los que tienen dinero.
Buyers are coming because Mexico's state-owned oil company, Pemex, is exploring for oil and gas here. The region's a geological extension of the Permian Basin of Texas and New Mexico, the highest producing oil field in the United States, rich in shale deposits. Tony Payan's the director of Rice University's Mexico Center in Houston.
And obviously, this land is being reconsolidated in the hands of a few, and possibly many of these politicians will have interests in the shale development in the future and will likely get a hold of that land no matter what.
With oil and gas development and plans for pipelines, desert land that no one cared about is now valuable. Chihuahua's Secretary of Public Works told a Juarez newspaper in September that he won't reveal the exact routes for the new roads because the government doesn't want to fuel land speculation. I asked another person about that.
Pues es que siempre el poder y la lana, claro, pues.
This is all about power and money, he replied. He alleged that bureaucrats and politicians are now in the real estate business, acting at the very least as middlemen to sell farmland to investors. Again, Tony Payan.
They are using, it is quite evident to me, that information for themselves in a way that they can position themselves as a political class to profit from this industry in the future. Oil, gas, and of course, the pipelines themselves.
Back in Guadalupe, physical evidence suggests that someone doesn't want people here. Burned houses, shattered glass, very few people on the street.
El Valle de Juárez es sin ley.
This valley is a lawless place, another man says. It's the sad truth.
Esa es la triste realidad.
Mexican authorities cited in media reports say at least 300 people have been killed in this one town since 2008. Mayors, police, city councilors, business owners, human rights activists. People are learning a hard lesson about real estate.
You know the rule, location, location, location.
Julian Cardona is a photographer from Juarez. He's watched a slow-motion depopulation unfold here. He says residents tell him that authorities don't do anything.
Every time there was a killing, every time there was a burning house, the soldiers were a block away. They didn't stop the killers or the people burning the houses.
Pipeline companies north of the border in Texas are historically granted the right of eminent domain to seize private land because the transport of energy is deemed to be in the public's interest.
In the United States, it's a lawful eminent domain. In Mexico, it's outright violence.
That's El Paso lawyer Carlos Spector. He represents 250 former residents of the Juarez Valley, many from Guadalupe, now seeking asylum in the U.S.
Investors are getting very aggressive. All they have to do is get a list from the mayor of a small town who he's under their control as to who hasn't paid the taxes. And if they can match up who hasn't paid the taxes to where the gas and the freeway's coming, then you go after that property. It's very, very scientific.
People who remain in Guadalupe say that former neighbors who fled are anxious to sell their now abandoned land for cents on the dollar because they're too frightened to even contemplate coming back.
Okay, stop.
Lorne Matalon, KJZZ News, Guadalupe, Chihuahua.
Okay, sorry, we'll just stop it there. Look, they say that if the speaker can't boil it down, that you guys have to sweat it out. So I'm going to conclude my remarks there. I really appreciate your attention. I really feel that Mexico is portrayed, you know, with devils and angels, black and white. It's a really nuanced country. It's a great country. It has unbelievable potential, notwithstanding some of the obstacles to energy reform that I've outlined for you. There are obstacles that people in Mexico City, far from wanting to avoid, far from shrinking from it, they kind of want to embrace solutions to it. This country is a part of that, and we're going to have to see whether this uncertainty that's been injected into the markets with the new U.S. administration comes to have an effect on the energy sector. But I believe it will succeed, and you know, if I wasn't a journalist and I had a lot of money, I'd be investing in it myself right now. Thank you very much for your attention. If anybody has any questions, feel free.
Well, since I have the mic, I'm going to take the first question while we queue up a couple others. One thing that I found interesting was you mentioned there's going to be another national election coming up in Mexico in about a year and a half, and there's a non-zero chance that they could go back and renationalize these oil and gas companies. And especially given the fact that an offshore rig is a 10 to 12 year investment timeline just to get it financed, built, online, drilling and producing, that's a little bit of uncertainty.
It's a lot, and you're absolutely right. The thing is that none of this uncertainty on the Mexican side is going to materialize if the candidate who's currently leading in the polls does not win. The issue is what's going to happen if he does, because he, like our current president, has made statements that we don't know if they're going to actually be translated, right? There's a lot of statements. We just saw a letter last week from the White House to congressional staffers suggesting, implying that there may not be such an aggressive move to dismantle NAFTA, right? Big news for the Mexicans. The thing is, if he does win, he will not be able to undo a constitutional change. He cannot single-handedly, with the stroke of a pen, change the law. This is what he can do. What he can do is gum up the permitting process. He can slow down applications. He can forget to move on certain applications. Not good for business, right? Really simple. So I believe that if he were to win, that people would come to him and say, look, do something that's cosmetic so that you can say we still control our natural gas and oil assets, but don't dismantle it, right? And as I say, he couldn't do it with a stroke of a pen, but he could make things really bad. And I can tell you that you know, it's unfair to dismiss this guy as some sort of leftist, ardent nationalist. I mean, he is the mirror of Donald Trump, right, except from a different point of view. Both of them are protectionist. Both of them, on the surface, are isolationist. And that's just terrible on both sides of the border for an industry that is so integrated right now. You know, cross-border electricity is going to expand, expansion of natural gas pipelines into Mexico. And again, we started off talking about the promise of social development. That's why this story matters, at least to me, is because we could have a much more secure neighbor on our southern tier. You know, people leave Mexico, although I've got to point out, right, the Pew Charitable Trust since 2015 has documented this. Net migration into this country from Mexico is either at zero or below zero. So there's a whole red herring to say that the people are at the gates and storming us. That's just not the case. But the point is, those people who do want to leave might be less tempted to do so were conditions better in their own country. And remember that the Mexican government historically, for decades, has not been involved in substantive job creation, in economic stimulus. And the reason for that is, as one political scientist at ITAM, a very well-known private university whose alumni grace the halls of power in Mexico, he said, look, I want the border built. And he said, I'll tell you why, before I could even ask him why. And this is a metaphor, but what he wanted, he said, I don't care if it's with drones and cameras or by bricks and mortar, but for too long the Mexican elite and the ruling class has coddled the notion that if things are bad at home, we can export our problem to the United States. And if there was a sort of a more pronounced move to seal the border, for lack of a better word, perhaps people might be motivated in power here in Mexico to generate job creation. So I don't have an answer to the uncertainty. I just know how people are looking at it. And I should point out that many of them who are mortified when such an anti-Mexican president was elected here have started to note what's been happening here, and they're less concerned, right? They're less concerned. I talked about the letter last week, the healthcare failure, the Russian imbroglio, which seems to be handcuffing him right now. These are things that are really bad news, but for the Mexicans, just in this narrow focus, they're saying, well, maybe he won't be as damaging to us as he's threatened to be as a candidate because he's got other fish to fry. Yes, sir.
How do you think Pemex will handle the Odebrecht scandal?
Good question. You know, they claim that they're. I mean, I don't have an answer answer for you, except that they claim that they're aware of it and that they want to deal with the investigations, et cetera. I should point out that the same thing's happening in Colombia, right? This is not restricted to
I know that there was a pretty large renewable energy component to the energy reforms, and you didn't get much of a chance to touch on that other than the wind turbines in the picture. I wonder, are they having issues like Pemex is having with people tapping the pipelines? Are there, taps on the electricity grid or a tax on the grid? I know residential use in Mexico is, pretty rampantly stolen, but is that, stretching further to transmission lines and things like that?
So you've talked about the pipelines being tapped and drones and things being used to try and address that. How much of the problem do you think is technical with finding people stealing versus due to the incentive structure of a nationalized industry? How much do you think the problem of the pipelines being tapped and people stealing from them, how much do you think that's like a technical problem of finding thieves versus this being a government industry and the incentive structure being different than in America? So maybe that's causing more problems with finding offenders because it wouldn't be as motivated to find them because it's a government industry.
So I do think to Pemex's credit, it's trying to get a handle on the problem, but it's so vast, right? It keeps growing and growing and growing that it's impossible to get a handle on it. And I don't know what the solution is. It's really easy for me to stand here and tell you what the problem is, right? But until you have, there's a company from Israel that's doing a pilot project with cameras, right? Cameras and tripwires, things like that. But you don't even have to go and take it from a pipeline, right? You can drive your truck up, in the Burgos Basin in Tamaulipas. You can drive a truck up and say, I'm going to kill you, give me your truck. And the guy says, here are the keys. Boom, that's it. So the other thing is that the financial incentive, right? You can spend about, $10,000 to $15,000 to get the equipment you need. You can make that back in a day or two and then go from there. So I do think Pemex is trying to get a handle on it, but it's really hard. It's very unwieldy and very cumbersome when you have so many ex-workers participating, and some workers, perhaps. We don't know that, right? But there have been at least 50 people in Pemex who've been convicted in Mexico. And I should point out, 5 companies in Texas have also been convicted of receiving that stolen oil. So this is not restricted to Mexico. Mexico, we can't sort of sit there and look, pejoratively at Mexico, because American companies, all in Texas, have been the beneficiary of stolen oil.
Got a question, go ahead.
We've seen corruption sabotage the deregulation of electricity markets, given, California, that deregulation clearly had a lot of problems, but we're still seeing, California try to come back and deregulate. What do you think happens for,
just say that I hope, if there is a God, that doesn't happen. I don't think they have a plan B. I think they're going to go full bore, and there's going to be, it's such a influx market, a market in flux that some parts of it will succeed and others won't. It may be that it'll be 15 to 20 years before we see the shale play in northern Mexico develop, because those companies are not as capitalized as the ones doing the offshore exploration, the E&P offshore. Those are huge players, right? Huge players. They're going to make sure it happens because of the money that they have. I haven't answered your question. I don't think there's anybody in Mexico who doesn't think it's going to succeed in some form or another. There may be some details that don't quite make it. But, I personally believe, there's some really dedicated people in Mexico, in Pemex. The problem is in Pemex, it's really hard to sort of, it's like turning a battleship. It takes a long time. It's hard to change that corporate culture, right? And there's a faction within Pemex that's, with the program. A lot of them educated in the United States, technocrats. They want to see this succeed. But you have these fossilized people at the top, not the very top. The CEO is a really good man, but there's so many people who don't want, people don't like change. It's a human nature. Right? They don't like change. They don't like to try. They like the tried and true, and they're afraid they might lose benefits. Right? Many Pemex workers have been fired because they have less than 3 years tenure. Older people are being, older, more experienced workers are being forced out. They're being given sort of a choice. You take this buyout package now, get off our books, or we're not so sure we're going to offer it to you when you're supposed to retire in 5 years. They're taking it. So I don't know what, I have not thought, it's a really good question. I don't know what would happen if this doesn't succeed, but in some form or other it will succeed because it has to, All right, well.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your questions. Please join us later if you can.